Hello, this is Britjet's PSX Tips, the Aerowinks PSX Boeing 747-400 desktop simulation, and today I'm going to give you some hints and tips about flying a circuit. Circuits. Why do we fly circuits? Well, anyone with a PPL knows why we fly circuits. We fly circuits to practice landings. There's no necessity to do that with PSX. You can just reposition the aircraft on finals numerous times using a situation, and frankly, to help your landings, that's probably better. But circuits have another function in that they can test how well we adapt to changing circumstances on the aircraft, how good our scan rate is on the instruments, how well we handle the aircraft with regard to trim settings, thrust settings, and so on, and how well we recover the aircraft from an unusual situation on the approach. There's no such thing as a perfect circuit. No one does one. However, there are many ways of making sure that you fly a safe circuit with a successful outcome. It's basically a series of stepping stones round the circuit from one successful point to another successful point, hopefully finishing up with an approach and a landing. If you find it's not going well, then don't panic. This is a difficult operation. We're trying to fly a 747 here, so relax from that point of view and just treat it as though you're enjoying the exercise. Now, the 747 in PSX is remarkably similar to the real aircraft in many ways in the way a circuit is flown. Thrust settings, flap, trim and so on are very, very similar indeed. So it will be a challenge, but we're actually going to fly the aircraft for circuits as though it was a great big Cessna, with the minimum amount of workload to ourselves. Now, I've flown many times with people doing circuits, and people do find it sometimes quite hard work. They get tired, they get stressed, and quite often they'll finish up strangling the joystick or the control column to try and make things work. So if that happens, all I would say is don't panic. On the contrary, think of it that you're actually getting a little bit tired, you're a bit stressed. Go and have a drink, walk the dog, whatever it takes. Leave it till another time and come back, and I guarantee you that you'll do a better job the next time round. Now, what we're going to do in this video is show you some diagrams of how we'd like to fly the circuit. At the end of that, we'll have a demonstration on video of the circuit. And at the end, probably the most important part, I will run through what are the common faults for a circuit. You may be able to identify with some of these and hopefully improve your flying abilities. So let's move on. Just before we start, please watch the landing and FPV videos in this series before this one. If you don't watch those, you will not understand what I'm talking about for the final approach segment. Thank you. I said we're going to fly it like a big Cessna. Have a look at all these, and I recommend you do everything that it says on here. It will give you a much easier time on the circuit. We're just going to concentrate on moving the flaps, the gear, the thrust and the trim. If you're using a scenery generator, set it for high frames per second. Get an ILS and try and find a runway where the PSX visual aspect agrees with the scenery generator visual aspect. Sometimes they tend to bring you in a little bit low, for example. The ILS doesn't quite agree with the runway. Try and find one that works on that. You can quite successfully fly a circuit just using the PSX scenery, because as you'll see in a moment, most of the views that we use on the circuit are actually used inside on the instruments. A really simple setup on the FMC, as you can see here. My circuit will be flown at 250 tons. It's a good medium weight, I recommend that. And then follow through the other features I've got here. The idea is not to have to reset bugs or touch the FMC at all while we're flying the circuit. Okay, the circuit in more detail. I'm going to fill in this diagram, which is a professional presentation that I've nicked. I've only changed one small thrust setting on it. Everything else is legitimate 747 figures, so it shows how accurate PSX is. We will fly the circuit at 1500 feet above the ground. You can fly a circuit at 1000 feet, but it makes life rather difficult, so 1500 it is, and we'll also make sure the wind is straight down the runway. Now I'm going to give some figures here which will be for the RB211. Those of you with the GE engines using N1s, apologies, try and find some equivalent figures before you go. The climb out then will be without the flight director on, and the first thing we're going to do is set about 1.5 EPA, just above the EPA rating on the ICAS, to get airborne, and the pitch attitude will be about 12.5 degrees. Notice that is red writing, and the red writing on this diagram is the most important thing there. Now this diagram is not a left-hand circuit, it's a vertical cross-section, up, along and down. I don't mind whether you fly left or right-hand circuit, I'm not going to be there after all. The important thing on the climb out is to ensure that you track straight away from the runway along the runway track. The little dotted line out from the runway will be a good guide. Try and stay on that. If you wander off, then obviously you will be displaced in the circuit. To level off at 1500 feet, we'll do it in 2 bites. The first bite will be at 1000 feet. Reduce the rate of climb by throttling back a bit. Bring it back to 1.4, just below the EPA rating, and at the 10 bug, retract the flaps to 10. Notice your pitch has come down to 10 degrees, we've come down 2.5 degrees. Now the idea of the rest of this circuit is to fly the speed at the flap 10 bug at 1500 feet until we get to late downwind. So anticipate the level off a little bit, and you're still climbing straight ahead at this stage, and at the approaching 1500 feet go down to a pitch attitude of 7.5. Another 2.5 down. Clever, isn't it? Leave the flaps where it is, fly the speed at the flap 10 bug, and you'll find you need to bring the thrust back quite a bit to about 1.22 EPA. Get yourself settled climbing straight ahead for the first circuit before you do a turn, and I'd like you to make sure you're in trim. Now a word about trimming. The tailplane on the back of the 747 is about as large as a small tennis court, and if you blip the trimmer just for a second or so, you will achieve absolutely nothing. If you're going to trim this aircraft, you have to press the trimmer in one direction or another for at least 2 seconds to achieve a result. So try and think of doing that. Great, you've got the aircraft in trim, you've flown straight up the dotted line, you're at 1500 feet. Now we're going to do a turn. Use 20 degrees of bank. Yes, I know you can use more, but 20 degrees is fine, and 25 will actually be quite difficult to hold your height. So 20 degrees it is, round you go onto the downwind heading. No drift, just roll out with about 10 degrees to go on the downwind QDM, the reversal of the runway QDM. And make sure you're flying accurately. It's all about pitch attitude. 7.5 degrees. If things need to be changed, then by all means change them, but those are your datums. And so you go downwind. Consider all your checks done. All you've got to do then, as we said earlier, was put your gear down and your flaps down for landing. Now the beam point is required to start your timing. That is a beam, the downwind part of the runway, the bit you land on. I'll give you a tip for where to find that in a minute, but basically it's 45 seconds at 1500 feet. It will be 30 seconds at 1000 feet. On your progress page 2, which you've cleverly set up already, you will see a headwind component or a tailwind component. You adjust your downwind timing, that 45 seconds, by the amount of wind component. So if you have a tailwind, you would reduce that 45 seconds. A 10 knot tailwind would be reduced by 10 seconds, so 45 would become 35, and so on. A short time after you've started your stopwatch and you're going downwind then, the next thing you need to do is put the gear down and flap 20. So this is the next stage we're at. Gear down, flap 20 at the same time, and pitching down again another 2.5 degrees to about 5. And that 5 attitude, hold it and let the speed slowly bleed back to the 20 bug. As you do that, bring the thrust back just a little bit to about 1.18 EPA. As you come to your timing, you're going to start your turn inbound, a continuous turn, And because you're flying a little slower than the outbound turn, you'll use a little bit less bank to ensure you come round on the centre line. Something like about 18 degrees of bank. Now this is the difficult bit. You have to judge your height with relation to the runway, as well as your spacing with relation to the inbound course, and you've got to keep your speed right. So there's a lot going on, and this is where you've got to be absolutely glued to your primary flight display, your speed and your attitude, and scanning your thrust as well. Now there's a tip with a standby horizon, which I'll come to, which will tell you early on whether you're coming above or below the glide slope. But at some stage, depending on whether you're high or low, you will select your final landing flap, which we're going to use 25 on this diagram, and come back to your datum thrust that we've discussed in earlier videos. How you do that will depend on how the circuit turns out. As I said, no circuit is perfect, but you must keep the aircraft under control the whole way through. As you turn round onto finals, you can use the track vector, which I'll explain shortly, to enable you to make a smooth turn on, and from then on it's a straight approach and landing, we hope. There is no doubt that that final base turn bit, bringing down the flaps 25 and adjusting your final thrust, is the most difficult bit. The thing to do is to have your scan rate very high and make small adjustments early. So that's the circuit, that's how we're going to fly it. Let's move on to the next bit. After touchdown, the priority is to keep the aircraft straight. Spend a bit of time on this before you do anything else. Make sure you've got it trundling straight down the centre. Then select the flaps to 20, stand up the thrust levers to allow them to spool up, and move the stab trim forward for a few seconds to get it to about 5. Then move the thrust levers forward to 1.5 EPA, just above the EPA writing, by which time you should be at VREF, and then rotate the aircraft away.